Okay, I won't hold us in suspense too much longer. Welcome, everyone. I'm Faith Cummings. I'm the co-chair of Climate Reality NYC with Paul, who is so graciously helping us go through all the slides. Our December chapter meeting is very aptly titled Less Stuff, More Connection, Reducing Waste and Consumption and Fostering Community. So thank you all for being here. Um, Next slide, Paul. Yeah, so we want to give you some exciting chapter news. So our January chapter meeting will be all about electrification resolution. So we want you to come join us and learn about electrification incentives. And we're going to have a breakout room for more info on specific topics like home, electric vehicles, and solar. So it's going to be really great. So bring all your questions in the new year. For February, we're going to focus on electrification in co-ops and condos. We've been getting lots of questions about that already, so that'll be great to gather about that. And then our most exciting news is that in April, we're going to have an in-person training that's going to be in New York City. So we're really, really excited about it. You can sign up to receive info on the CRP website. So we'll hope you'll do that. And we also invite you to follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, X, and YouTube. And we're regularly updating those and sharing news. So those are great ways to keep in touch with us and see, what's going on. Next slide, Paul. So getting into our great panelists. So first up is Anneliese Zausner-Mannes. Anneliese is a professional educator, program manager, and sustainability consultant. She's taught in the middle school STEM classroom across urban, private, and international schools in Asia, Europe, and the US. In 2020, Anneliese co-founded Nurture BK Compost in Brooklyn, committed to waste diversion, the circular economy, and mutual aid in New York City. Currently, with Big Reuse, she works with council members across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens on compost application and education. Anneliese is passionate about learning and equal access, making sustainability both attainable and realistic while clarifying the greenwashing recent trends that have been brought about. So thank you so much, and I will pass it over to you, Anneliese.
Thank you, Faith. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully just jump in. I have so much to share, so I'm going to go quite quickly. I'm going to make some presumptions that a lot of you have some core understandings already. And of course, we can save some time at the end for the Q&A, and happy to answer anything that I can. And if I don't have an answer, of course, get you the answers that you need or the people who might be able to answer them. So that being said, I am currently working with education as an education director at Big Reuse. I work explicitly with council members across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. It's a huge privilege. Especially, I'm sure you have all heard about these budget cuts and how they are affecting the New York City Compost Project. I do not work for DSNY directly, and therefore have a lot of freedom to share what I know and to think and to speak openly about it, which is a huge privilege. And I will share what I can. So jumping in, I'm going to talk about Nurture BK and composting in general. I'll also talk about Big Reuse and the multiple aspects that Big Reuse offers. And then I'll talk about waste consumption and circular economy. Like I said, going a bit quickly, but starting off to give you some background, the journey, it's really said there in 2020, we lost all funding because of COVID-19. And one of the things that got cut was curbside collection. So we started a collection, and it's been 3.5 years and we're still here. So we collect compost. That was how we started, food scraps. We have a unique setup. It's not just a green bin. These black tough boxes is what they call them, TUFF. Tough boxes in front is where we would accept compost, food scraps, organics, and we would go through them looking for contamination. As most of you probably already know, microplastics and PFAS are a huge problem when it comes to soil health and agriculture in general. So knowing that we were bringing this directly to someone who was bringing it to a farm and they were really worried about contamination, we took that extra step and we still have it. So while most of our community members now are very well versed and understand what contamination is, from plastic stickers to twist ties to meat products, we continue to educate people that show up every day, every Sunday, I'm sorry, every week, and are new. In the back, you see those tins. That's where we begin shopping. So we actually begin the process of breaking down the compost on site. We are a pop-up, as you can see. We are there Sundays 9 to 11. It's the southeast corner of Prospect Park. And this Sunday will actually be our last, or so we think. We're not really sure what's going to happen, but it's definitely going to be our last for this year, annually in 2023, due to the holidays, because the budget cuts are set to begin on January 1st. We're not sure what it will look like. There are still a lot of, there's a lot of unknowns around that. This is an article, I think it's a bit lofty, but New York Magazine did an expo on community heroes in 2021. If you're more curious to learn about our operation, you're welcome to. In December, we started a food fridge because we saw that a lot of people were not throwing out organic waste or food scraps, but actually food waste, and we began in December of 2020 collecting food and following the mutual aid model of share, share what you can, take what you need. So we began doing that. People wanted swag, and we were really against producing or getting new things made. So we actually went to thrift stores and sourced sourced plain t-shirts of all sizes and screen printed them at EPA in Manhattan in the garment industry by hand, all volunteers, and sold them on a sliding scale. So we really try in everything we do to be really sustainable. We've been lucky to work with, that's our assembly member, Mr. Cunningham, Brian, and then Rita Joseph, our council member on the right. We've planned different events with them. Again, we are a completely volunteer-run organization in an EJ neighborhood, trying to just reach out and educate as much as we can. So in addition to our community fridge, we also at one point were collecting plastics, hard to recycle plastics. We've done shoe collections. We continue to collect candle wax and candle scraps, which we melt down and create fire starters with. We also continue every Sunday to collect reusable bags and corks. This is very much an average Sunday. We do it once a month. We're collecting these Fresh Start bags and passing them on to Miss Naima, who is running Flatbush, or one of the people who runs and organizes our community fridges in our neighborhood and throughout Brooklyn. So they're able to use those bags for redistribution. And corks, that's a 55-gallon container. We filled that ourselves, not in one day, but over time. Corks used to be made of cork, which is totally compostable. It's a tree bark. However, there are all sorts of other plastics and materials in it these days. So unfortunately, they're not compostable, but the Ready Center, which is in Red Hook, is using them to create floating gardens. So we are redistributing them and collecting them for them. We focused a lot on greenwashing and buzzwords. There's a lot around compostable bags that people think is really great. And at the end of the day, we really just invite people to think about what it means to create the infrastructure and energy needed to create a plastic bag that's compostable, the fact that there are microplastics in there, and the fact that depending on how you are dropping your compost, it's not necessarily going to be composted. For example, if you're dropping it in a smart bin, the orange bins across the city, they use a Tiger machine to separate plastics from their compost and food scraps. So that Tiger machine doesn't know the difference between a plastic bag and a compostable bag. So oftentimes those compostable materials that you're spending money on and that obviously required infrastructure to create end up in the trash. Alternatively, you could be using brown bags to add to the carbon nitrogen balance, or of course, a reusable container. So these are some of the things we do. Again, sharing all of this out on Instagram and in our newsletter. We're really low key. We just try to spread what we know and share that education. We also talk about the fact of composting as a verb versus composting as a noun. So composting is the process, right, of turning it into leaves and food scraps into this fertilizer in a pile like this. Obviously, the background is a little different in our city. And then compost as a noun, which is the final product. And I share this explicitly because I'm going to talk later about the difference between the verb compost and the noun, because the verb, I think, is used very generously in some situations. So the noun, the finished product. The smart bins that I was just mentioning are on the left, the orange smart bins, and then of course the brown bins are on the right. Depending on what borough you live in, you might have access to that. In Queens and Brooklyn, we have a rollout where curbside, the brown bins are all over. It is supposed to be rolling out to the Bronx and Staten Island and then Manhattan by 2024. So the end of the year. We'll see how that goes. Again, with the recent budget cuts, we're not sure. Anaerobic digestion. This is a huge topic right now. There are several articles. Again, I'm happy to share. Anaerobic digestion. This is in Newtown Creek. There was recently an article in Gothamist. Our friend Willis at Newtown Creek Alliance actually wrote to them saying, hey, it's not on. And there's a lot of sketchy looking gas coming out of it. Anaerobic digestion is a process of composting, the verb. However, there's no compost product at the end of it. It's supposed to be feeding back into the grid and fueling homes. The problem is that it's not working consistently. There are mixed reports about that, but essentially anything that you're putting in an orange bin or a brown bin, by and large, for the most part, is going here. It's not turning into finished compost. Some in Staten Island may be becoming compost, but it's a small percentage. The majority of curbside compost and smart bins end up in anaerobic digestion. And then a map. This can be easily accessed online. These are the orange bins, the smart bins all over the city. And the green bins, which is community composting, which again, in the mayor's recent budget cuts, he has eliminated completely. So as of January 1st, there will be no more community composting or green bins. So big reuse. This is the cool part. We are a New York City based NGO. We have over 45 staff, 3 community composting sites, one in Brooklyn, one in Queens, and one in Red Hook. And we have 70 FSDOs. Again, those will be closing with the recent budget cuts, and a reuse center warehouse. So this is under the Queensboro Bridge. You can see this is what happens. All those green bins, community composting, are dumped here. They are put in this huge pile, turned a few times with very little infrastructure. They're kept in these windrows, and we measure the temperature to make sure that it's not getting too hot, but just hot enough for the microbes to do their thing and give us some really nutritious finished finished compost to remediate our soil with. And we sift it to get out any, again, stickers, twist ties, whatever might be left over. And we've got finished compost. So this is our site, 680,000 kilograms composted annually here, again, under the Queensboro Bridge. And this is the salt lot in Gowanus. Same thing, we're composting about 365 kilograms annually. So this is our warehouse, just a peek. It's like a thrift store, but we take everything. So we do have toilets and sinks and sofas, and it is not curated for any hipster. It's really just to reuse, to keep things out of landfill and really focus on a circular economy, reusing truly, in recycling in the truest sense of the word. This is my team. I'm lucky, like I said, to work with these council members and to serve them with compost application and education. We've done in the past year and not even a half. These numbers are actually, I could update them. We've cared for over 1,000 trees and done well over 100 events, working with probably close to 5,000 volunteers. So this is why. These are what our street trees look like, the beds, and they're not in the best condition. You can see the soil's compounded. It affects the tree's health, which of course affects the air quality because the trees are giving us that urban canopy that we all talk about. So just some pictures. Again, I know I'm going quickly, but I want to get to the root of it, and I have so much to cover. We also go into libraries. This is my colleague Gil Lopez, who some of you may or may not know, is very active in the community. The parent of this child did give us permission to share. It was totally not staged, as you can see. He was teaching about worms and vermiculture. So waste and consumption. The meat of this program and why I'm here is really to talk about the circular economy model. This is from the European Parliament Research Service. It's something, again, you're probably all familiar with already. Just thinking about recycling isn't just about that end, it's thinking about where we start and making sure that each step of the process, from designing it to begin with, producing it, distributing it, consuming it, collecting it, and then really managing the waste. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today, the EPA, this was the 2018, so MSW stands for Municipal Solid Waste. I always focus on the food because compost is food. I then looked at DSNY's website and they quoted that 10,000 tons of garbage a day. So some quick math, if we consider 24% and 20 million pounds of garbage, that means that we have about I'm sorry, yes, 20 million. Okay, that means that we have about 5 million pounds of food waste in New York City daily. This to me is why composting is so important. But there's also textiles. And I know Carlos is going to talk about compost, so I'm going to lean into textiles a bit more. This is something I have a bit of bias on. My parents were both in textiles. I'm a quasi first generation New Yorker. I was born here. My mother was born and raised here to immigrants, and my father came to this country for my mother. So they worked in the garment industry when it was still real products. And as a result, I have a lot of wool and kind of pure fabrics that got attacked during COVID. And it made me look deeper into how fabrics are made and how much we know about it. So just thinking about something that might seem simple is not. Even when we think about wanting to be sustainable with cotton or with a pure, wool product, it goes through a huge process. And when you think about the fact that not everything is made of a pure fabric, it gets pretty messy. A lot of you probably, again, know this, but just thinking about crude oil and energy, not only the reagents that produce synthetic materials like nylon, spandex, rayon, all of it, but also the dyes and finishing agents. And then, of course, carting it wherever it needs to go, the distribution of it, depending on what country it's produced in and what country it's sold in, how it's used, cleaned, and then, of course, what happens to it after. So I learned about something called darning and specifically visible mending. So this is where we come into thinking about the holidays and thinking about what we can reuse and how we can gift people and maybe make our own closet a bit more special. A lot of these photos are from someone named Celia Pim. She is in many ways considered a mother of this movement, but there are many mothers and many fathers and many other people who are stewarding this space. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this was hers. I think I skipped one. Yeah, here. This is actually what happened. I'm not sure of the story of how it became a sweater that looked like this. But she writes, mending work builds on what's left behind. It's not replacing, it's not remaking, it's not cutting apart and putting back together. Instead, it's slow work that makes things better. So again, you can read for yourself, but it's just talking about really, I want to say, anchoring threads and yarn into the robust, healthy fabric, filling holes and reinforcing areas that are weak. This is what it became. This is one of her more famous pieces. And it's obviously not trying to be what it was. It's something else. It's something quite remarkable, in my opinion. It's called visible mending purposely because it's celebrating the cracks. So it follows those of you that might be familiar with kintsugi or wabi-sabi, the Japanese art centuries ago when pottery, it started with ceramics, would break, they would seal it with gold to celebrate the cracks. And it follows this kind of mentality. I'm going to just show you a bit more. Some pieces. So again, whether it was a hole, whether it was overused, whether it was a moth, whatever it is, these are her pieces. There are many other pieces, but it's quite a simple process and one that I learned recently, and I am actually wearing right now, as much as you may or may not be able to see, a piece that was mended by someone local in Brooklyn who has shared a bunch of resources with me that I'm also sharing with you. So again, kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. it's the same, but we're taking it as a philosophy. You could see this is a paper bag that Celia mended. Obviously, many people would take a paper bag and put it in a recycling bin, or maybe put their compost in it to add some carbon to the nitrogen of their food scraps. But as a philosophy, it treats breakage and repair as part of the history of an object rather than something to disguise. So it's a really awesome opportunity and time for all of us post COVID, post what the last years have brought, and in the midst of everything going on and the uncertainty that we're really living with every day, especially here in New York, to think about how you could mend something and kind of dip your feet into thinking about celebrating an object that may have been past its time and instead recreate it. These resources will be shared with you all. These are from Sam. Sam Bennett is local in Brooklyn. She is, I know her through Nurture, and she actually is the one that repaired this piece here. So full credit to Sam. It's got more holes, but I'm not going to stand up and do a twirl. I'm happy to send photos if you're interested, but these are all resources where you can learn more. You can attend a workshop if you want to gift a friend a workshop for the holidays, if you know that they're into fabrics and kind of thinking about circular economy and rescuing, especially when you have things that are made of wool or cashmere. The sweater that I'm wearing is a cashmere sweater. It was given to my mom from someone a bit bougier than we are. So it's had a few lives. It's definitely probably been around since the 60s. And I'd say it was an awesome opportunity because I was just using it as something that kept me warm without knowing. And then I woke up. So, and then I paid someone and then learned very quickly that that's not sustainable either. And I've been learning how to do it myself and doing it as a result, which is also quite a meditative practice. That's it for me. I know I went fast, but I really wanted to give everyone space. In terms of big reuse, we recently had, thanks to Councilmember Hanif, we were able to do a lamp repair and rewiring back in October. It was at our warehouse, which is in Gowanus in Brooklyn. And you can see some photos here. Really, really amazing turnout. We actually sold out of our tickets. We didn't have enough space for everyone. This is Fred, our store manager, a beautiful human being who was introducing the leaders of the workshop, who went around. Some people brought, some people bought, but they learned how to rewire lamps. Again, just keeping things out of the landfill. We have 3 upcoming events at Big Reuse. On the 27th, Clothing and Mending with Willis. So it'll be tips on how to buy vintage and basic clothing mending. I can't promise Darning will be there, but if you're interested, let me know. February 24th, we'll have vintage and antique repair, specifically concentrated on furniture and wood. And then on the 23rd, we'll be working on appliances. So small appliances and giving advice on repairing medium and larger scale items. So that's what Big Reuse has to offer. Again, I feel like I'm probably over time, so I apologize, but that's everything I have to offer. I'm happy to be a resource after this Q&A. If you want to reach out, obviously through any channel, I'm more than happy to answer anything, lead you in a direction, or find you someone who could answer it. So thank you all for your time. And I'm going to hand it back to Faith or over to Carlos, probably back to Faith.
Yeah, you can hand it back to me. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I need to attend one of those clothing mending workshops and make my grandmother proud that I can, sew and do some things. So thank you so much, Anneliese. So next, I would love to speak about Carlos Pesantes. Carlos is the founder and executive director of the Compost Collective, an organization run by volunteers dedicated to environmental education. He has worked in public health as an environmental scientist and community coordinator for over 15 years. Feeling frustrated with the lack of response to environmental issues, Carlos examined his own personal choices, joined a local CSA, started a food scrap drop-off in his community, and became a master composter. The Compost Collective was officially formed in 2012 when it moved to its current location, and it has now grown to serve over 500 households in the local Forest Hills area. Carlos believes in the power of connection, inclusion, balance, and youth empowerment. Although he knows change begins with one person, he sees that our collective power can create long-lasting effects for generations to come. In his spare time, Carlos enjoys reading, gardening, beekeeping, playing music, cooking, and a good cup of tea. I do as well. So welcome, Carlos, and I will pass it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. We have a slide deck. I believe that Deepa is going to be driving it. So thank you, Deepa, for doing that. And thank you for having me. My journey started with the Compost Collective. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Um, as a as an inspector for the Department of Health. And so pretty much I was working in public health engineering, and my job was to look at surface water and groundwater. And next slide. And so pretty much what ended up happening was that, just keep on going, next slide. uh, and what ended up happening was, next slide, please. I have quite a few slides, sorry. So one of the things that ended up happening was that I got sent to a location in Jackson Heights. And the location in Jackson Heights was at a church on like 30 something Avenue. And the complaint was that we thought that it was a well. Most car washes and churches or faith-based organizations have some sort of well in New York City to provide them water. So we thought that maybe there was some sort of cross-contamination that was happening. What ended up happening was that it was an earth machine that was there, and it kind of looks like a well. That's what wells look like. And so when I went there, the minister person there said, I said, what is this? And he said, it's a compost machine. And I was like, I never heard of composting in school, so I didn't know. So sort of the journey sort of began there. Anyways, the mission statement: the Compost Collective is a community-based volunteer organization. Our mission is to be the solution of climate change and create a safe space for wildlife to thrive, and provide quality of life services to our community. Next slide, please. Our goal is to achieve our mission through a community approach by engaging and educating the community in soil remediation, sustainable gardening, and educational opportunities. Next slide. Thank you. So we at the Compost Collective believe in mutual understanding that everything is interconnected, and that is the key to life. The key to life is balance. We believe in equity, fairness, and respect. We have a zero bullying rule. The Compost Collective receives no funding from the City of New York. Our community is generous, and we fund our efforts through their gifts. And we will speak, I will speak about gifts later. Actually, what I'm giving you today is what we give everyone, because we mandate classes, and it's an introduction class that we give. When we first started doing the classes, next slide, we were doing the classes with, and it was like a 3-hour, really intensive composting class. And it was too much. And we were doing it at the Church in the Gardens, which is a local church near us, and which was giving us the space, which was really lovely of them. And we ended up moving it towards something else that was a little bit more digestible for everyone. And that was like short and sweet, but to the point. And this is what I'm giving you. So a little history. So we started watching, when I moved to Queens from Hell's Kitchen, I moved to Forest Hills. And my wife and I started watching, my girlfriend and I at the time, we started watching a lot of environmental documentaries at the Church in the Gardens. And so what ended up happening from that, it's like we started finding out about droughts, extinctions, environmental refugees, global warming, and all these awful things that are happening today. And we were just defeated. It felt really bad. At the end of it, there was always somebody from St. John's University, a professor, and he would talk. And I always felt like there was like nothing that could be done. It was like this very defeatist way of looking at things. I was just like, this is terrible. Why am I watching these things? Next slide, please. And so, I started thinking a lot about different things and about how we are, like, everything is interconnected. So I often ask people what they do for a living. So, like, what is your name? Where do you come from? What do you do? What do they like to do? Who are you? And, we spend so much time, like, at work doing the things that, hopefully we're passionate about, that, it's important to sort of know where people are coming from. And I like to ask, like, where do you come from? As in, like, where do you live? Like, are you living in Queens? Are you living in Brooklyn? What neighborhood are you in? What borough? Like, what's going on, right? So, because trying to find those connections. Next slide, please. So I knew that I needed to act and I needed to do something, but I didn't know what I could do. So, we started seeing that, there was, we needed something to find something that was equitable and accessible to everyone, something that was free, preferably, and that could be impactful for the environment and make a difference. So I needed a plan, and I had my first 2 steps down. So I researched a little bit on the internet, and I looked it up, and they had a master composter course, the Queens Botanical Gardens, which was great. I signed up for it. I connected to my community board, so I started attending community board meetings. If you haven't done that, I suggest you do that. It's where it's at, and it's depending on the community board, it gets pretty interesting. And all roads were paved with trash, unfortunately. Next slide. So I watched the movie. It was called Dirt. I don't know if any of you have seen it. So the story of the hummingbird, pretty much there's a big fire that's consuming the forest. And in this forest, while this is happening, all the animals are on one side of the river watching their house pretty much burn down. And this really touched me, like at a really deep level. And one little bird starts going into the water and starts grabbing water and putting it into the fire and trying to put it out. And so the animals are looking at it. They're like, what are you doing? Are you crazy? So the bird sort of stops for a minute and they're like, and it pauses and responds, I am doing my best. I am doing what I can. And that resonated with me enormously. Next slide, please. So what is compost? Compost is a way of turning things that were once alive, like plants or food scraps, into something that can help new plants grow. It is made by letting tiny living things like bacteria and fungi eat the dead things and turn them into dark, crumbly substance that looks like soil. Compost is good for plants because it has a lot of nutrients and it helps the soil hold water and air better. Next slide, please. So definition of waste, which I think they go hand in hand, right? So it's sort of like the light and the shadow. So to use, to consume, to expend thoughtlessly, carelessly, or to no avail, to fail to take advantage of, to waste an opportunity. The act of wasting or state of being wasted, a failure to take advantage of something. So where, we were looking at a lot of waste, a lot of garbage, I started seeing opportunities as to what could be done. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little trash, and we like to talk trash, as we say at the compost site, at the Compost Collective. Next slide. So we're a wasteful society. Americans waste $40 per every $100 worth of food they purchase. Here in New York City, we're a little bit better. We actually waste about $25 per every $100 that we spend, and usually at the supermarket, and most of that food actually goes into the waste stream. Next slide. So why are we talking about trash? New York City has, over almost 9 million people now, according to the U.S. Census, and more coming every day. I am actually working in the Sunseeker respite centers and the HERCs and all those things right now. And people just keep coming because New York City is sort of like the #1 destination. So an average American creates about 5 pounds of waste daily and wastes about 40% of all the food purchased, as we found out a minute ago. New Yorkers are fare better, like I said before, with about 25% of that. EPA began reporting on the generation and disposition of waste over 35 years ago. The average New Yorker produces about 3 pounds of garbage daily. That's the average. So that if you add that up, it comes out to about half a ton per year, which is quite a bit. Next slide, please. So our waste has a long lasting effects few care to notice. And I don't know if you can see it, but do you see the rat? We used to have landfills here in New York City, but we filled them all to capacity. Historically, garbage dumping in poor, disadvantaged, underinvested neighborhoods near water sources, poor and disenfranchised, seen as disposable due to socially reinforced norms backed by governmental segregation. We believe our government has the obligation to remediate. I work in local government, so because of that, I felt like a necessity to act. Collect Pond Park, which is where here in Queens, in Manhattan, it's actually where 125 Worth is, which is the Department of Health. And the reason why the Department of Health is the oldest Department of Health in the nation is because it was to tackle a cholera outbreak that happened there. And that also happened to be a very poor neighborhood that was called Oh my goodness. It's failing me right now, but it was in that movie Gangs of New York. Next slide, please. Five Corners. I believe that's what it was. Okay. Market-driven waste, our waste generation has only been reduced during recession years. So Fresh Kills in Staten Island, for those of you that are a little older, like I am, I'm in my 50s, was situation next to was placed next to an estuary. Now it's a park, which cost the lives of countless flora and fauna due to colonialist relationship to the land and a lack of adequate planning. The Pennsylvania Avenue landfill in Brooklyn next to Jamaica Bay is now the Shirley Chisholm State Park. If you haven't visited, it's quite beautiful. And it costs the taxpayers millions and millions of dollars. And it will continue to cost millions of dollars in environmental remediation. And the disruption to the estuaries, bird and marine species, diets and behavior are all negatively impacted because of our consumption. Next slide, please. So where does our waste go? We are waste exporters. Our trash travels, it goes to different places, it gets processed in Staten Island, it goes to New Jersey, it goes on to Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, and then it travels off from there. And it can go to like many other different locations, ending up in native lands in South Dakota, North Dakota. It could end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. I don't know if some of you remember, there was like a barge with our garbage that was like traveling around. It was pretty disturbing. So landfills, methane, and global warming, right? So methane is a dangerous greenhouse gas produced in landfills from our garbage, and it affects our air, the ozone layer in our water negatively. And methane gas traps in heat and contributes greatly to the global warming. Next slide, please. Coastal flooding, which is always like a concern of mine. Global warming, creating havoc, giving greater frequency of storms and coastal flooding. You know, we are in islands, right, with the exception of the Bronx, and so we are affected by this. Every time there's a nor'easter, and every time that we're like in like heavy rains. I mean, here in Queens where we live, I think last year some people died in Forest Hills because of necessity, live in basements, and people drowned in their homes. Next slide, please. And thank you, Deepa, for driving. So flash flooding remnants from Hurricane Ida in 2021. And here are some of the flood zones, as you can see here. And the 100-year flood zone, according to FEMA, then the 500-year flood zone, and the Hurricane Sandy flood zone. I now work in emergency management for the Department of Health. And one of the things that we do is we look at these things, and you know, and we're trying to prepare as best as we can. But my introduction into all of this was during Superstorm Sandy as like the first response, doing environmental assessments the day after the storm hit. Next slide, please. So leachate, volatile organic compounds, heavy metals, BPA, phthalates, nitrogen, and contamination of ground and surface water. The water content of our food is high, a minimum of 370 per gallon to create a burger, right? So we should tax the price of processed water and water used for agricultural purposes instead of subsidizing it. And I think that's something that we do here quite a bit. Every time that I see like a door of like I'm just going to use a place like Abercrombie and Fitch or something, where they would like blast the AC. Like it would drive me insane because that's water, and that water, like, you know, that's in the reservoirs, actually cost people their towns and their livelihoods because they flooded all these valleys in order to create that. Anyways, next slide. And, you know, and I know that Anneliese was talking about you know, PFAS and things like that. And those are things that are showing up in our bloodstream now, even in children as they're being born. So every time you shop, you're voting. And that's something that I want everybody to remember. And I put this picture, which I thought it was quite graphic in a way. It's a water bottle, just so you know. But it's so you understand like what's happening, because we teach this class to children and we teach it to like everybody, and we have volunteers that go from like 4 years old to like 84 years old, and so we try to be impactful in how we present things. There are plastic patches in every ocean in the world, and microplastics are a concern. Next slide, please. There's no plan B, unless you're the owner of Tesla and you think you could take us to space. So thinking back to my military service, it is easy to get lost and overwhelmed sometimes, and it's good to do a little box breathing technique to get your bearings and act, right? And if you don't know what box breathing is when you actually feel a little bit overwhelmed and you take in like a deep breath, and then you exhale it, and then you hold it, and then you take in like try to take twice as much, and then you count, and then you exhale, and you continue the process until you start feeling better. Next slide, please. So what is compost? We get back to compost again. Compost is a process that creates balance by transforming organic putrescible waste into valuable fertilizer. Next slide, please. So we talk a little bit about surface area and how surface areas created in order to be able to have the smaller the pieces, the greater the surface area, and the easier for the decomposers to break down. And that's the decomposers. We talk about the FBI, which is the fungi, the bacteria, the invertebrates, the roly-polies, which are really crustaceans, so it's really fun stuff. And so we try to make the class fun. Next slide. So what to compost? We talk about carbon, nitrogen, greens, browns, wet, dry, calcium, oh my, and we ask who has experience with compost, and people raise their hands, and we ask about like when, and we try to engage them, and we ask if people have pets, and if they have pets, we let them know that they can compost the pet fur or the pet hair, and people get really excited about that. And we also talk about like dryers and dryer lint. And we also talk a little bit of recycling the plastics being 1, 2, and 5. I think there's another number that's been added, but I feel like that's sort of like this chasing circle thing. It's something they sold us a bill of goods. Talking a little bit about pesticides at the compost side, we only accepted about 7% of things that we would call pesticide free. I try not to use words like organic and things like that because it's sort of they're all subjective. But 93% of the food that we consume that we can buy in supermarkets in the United States are treated with chemicals, pretty much. And then we talk a little bit about the types of composting that we do. We do frac composting, vermicomposting, hot composting, and we have food cultures, which do mycotic sort of style of breakdown. And then we let everybody know about static piles and windrows and earth machines and everything in between. Next slide, please. So we filter life through our experiences, confessions from a composter. So, and I believe this came from Gil, actually, and I should have put where the source was. There's a difference between kitchen scraps, parts of the fruit and produce that are generally inedible and should be composted, versus food waste, perfectly edible food that is wasted when it is left in the pantry, fridge too long, or dropped off to be composted or put in trash. One of the things that I wanted to say was that we actually have a table, because we actually started seeing, even in a neighborhood like Forest Hills, that is a middle-class neighborhood, because of the pandemic and because of the inflation that we've seen, people that are on the fringes, that are a little bit older, that are on fixed incomes, single moms, we actually during the pandemic started seeing people going into the green totes that Big or the Queens Botanical Gardens would provide, and actually pulling food out to take home to consume. So in order to take some of that stigma out, we created something called the abundance table. And so we would set it up so if you had like a loaf of bread or something that you wanted to bring, or a watermelon or oranges or some sort of fruit or some sort of food that was still edible, that was still okay to consume, we would put it aside so people could take it. And whatever was left was taken to a church in East New York. And usually, believe it or not, with the inflation, we've had less and less food being left over to take to East New York. Next slide, please. So green markets and composting. Composting edible food is wasteful. While it's better to be sending it to the landfill, it should be avoided. Composting programs do not exist to aid the overconsumption and waste. And I think that is something that we all see. We do live in a consumption-driven society. I think I had a slide there that said, I shop, therefore I am. So it is. These are concerns that we all have, and we try to educate and talk about this. And we try to drive the point that we vote every time we purchase something. Next slide, please. ooh, this got it's not displaying, but pretty much what I put here was a workflow diagram that talked a little bit about how we see creating community and how we build community. And so what we did was we started at the top and we went and we had a decision whether we wanted to create a compost site or not. And then we moved on to work ethic, and the work ethic is built, it's sort of fed by from the bottom to the top by integrity, by passion, by all the things that sort of matter, right? And those are the things that we call our common values, our common morality. And then we move on to the things that you get out of that, which are respect and pretty much influence. And that feeds into the other two things, which are sort of like the collective thinking, and it leads us into integrity, which leads us into like action. Next slide, please. And sorry that it didn't come through. So like I was saying, shared moral values, and it leads into trust and respect, and it leads to positive change in the community. And pretty much with that workflow, and I'm sorry that they didn't show, it talks about communities based on a trust and respect, foster collaboration and innovation. And that is something that we sort of discovered, and we try to like instill this on the kids, that to take ownership of their community, of their space, of everything that they see there at the site. Next slide, please. So the food scrap drop-offs, this is Chris Bivens and a couple other nice people that we know, and some of them are still with us and some of them are no longer with us, unfortunately. So New York City Green Markets, we were there. We decided to actually ask them that we wouldn't be there anymore, so they would hire people from the community, and they started hiring people from the community, which was really nice. We spend quite a bit of time educating and seeing waste as a resource. Next slide, please. So educating and creating community since 2012. This is a picture of just during the middle of the pandemic with some local teens. Next slide, please. This is just us like with setting up our beehives. And what you see behind the beehives is a hugel culture. There's a linear park that's most likely going to go there. Behind there is an abandoned railroad track. As for some reason, it seems like composting and abandoned railroad tracks go together. And then this is a median that's near my home that we planted trees on and that we sort of beautified. Next slide. We took ownership of the space. We went there. I mean, when we first went there, it was just abandoned trees. There was dirt. We found pieces of cars. It was a mess. It was a dump site. Oftentimes we would see like all these things from like the 40s, the 50s. When we actually tested the soil, we found out that the soil was at 405 parts per million for lead, which is kind of high. But if you see that the permissible amounts for your children to play in a playground is 400, you don't feel so bad. And then 200 parts per million in order to be able to plant food directly in the soil. That is the permissible levels. We haven't planted directly in the soil anything to consume because we've been mindful of everything. And every year we test. And we took a scientific approach, just because of my background, to test. So we've been testing, and we can generally say now that the soil at the site is actually testing really well. And for most locations within the site, it's testing 0 for lead. And that is due because we actually done something called lasagna gardening. Next slide, please. Where over years we laid, and you can see that on the left slide, we started laying cardboard, and then we started putting in biomass of different sorts. This is sawdust and wood chip, and we would just sort of like bring it in, and it was like sawdust and wood chip that came from somebody who was using reclaimed wood to make furniture and to make stairs and things like that. So we paired up with a miller, and we were able to do that. And so now when you go into the site, where before we were like sort of like at street level, now we're like way higher above street level. And one of the things that we noticed is when and this wasn't done on purpose, but one of the things that we noticed was that when it flooded there, even though there were cars there, if you see that building to the left, they're building garages in the basement, and all the cars flooded there. And some of the cars that were like on Yellowstone Boulevard, like that car that's passing by there, actually their license plates were flipped up because the water pressure was so high that it actually went up. And what you see there is our brand new at the time 3-bin system. Next slide, please. And so studying our liberated land, we started connecting with some of the Native American tribes that are still left in Eastern Long Island, and sort of invited them over. And, you know, they've been actually very nice, and we sort of collaborated on things. Unfortunately, the people that were there at one point, which was the Canarsie, are no longer around. Next slide, please. So old people want us respect and a sense of purpose. So volunteers to the core are getting to things done. People like to order to make sense of chaotic times. So people were coming in during the pandemic. We saw an upkeep of people coming in. People were walking from different places. That gentleman that you see in the back middle, he was actually coming from Laurelton. He was taking 2 buses to get there. And he actually created a food scrap drop-off site in Eastern Queens, which is one of those sites that's going to be affected. Next slide, please. And we wanted to give everybody a sense of belonging, a purpose. So people were actually coming and taking ownership. Next slide, please. And collaborate whenever possible and always educate. So we actually went and built raised beds in Kew Gardens for the community there. There's a space that actually, there's a cinema, and the cinema actually bought that park that in the 70s from the city of New York for $4. But unfortunately it was a mess. It was garbage, and it was like weeds, and it was just a terrible, terrible space. And so we went in there, and we, you know, just teamed up with a whole bunch of kids from the neighborhood and, you know, got them to do some work. Next slide. So we also connected with other organizations, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts. We connected with faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and, you know, veterans groups, and everybody who wanted to take part. Next slide, please. And jokingly, I said indoctrinate them, and I put Santa Claus. We actually saw that people in the neighborhood were charging $350 to have Santa come to your house. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So we bought a Santa suit, and we put a friend of mine who's a teacher, a Santa. And so we actually had people come and take pictures with Santa for free. So, and then we did a little concert. Next slide. And that sort of triggered off like a whole bunch of events that we do for Christmas. So if you want to have a good time, definitely come around Christmas time, and you'll have fun. Just like bees, everyone must work to enjoy the honey. And I don't know, maybe that's from my own native side. You know, we want everybody to work so that everybody can enjoy, and everybody can contribute those gifts that we're talking about, like, differently. Next slide, please. And by the way, that's Nick from Astor Apiaries. He's our master beekeeper. I'm a beekeeper myself, and we actually provide free training to our members. We actually raffle off once a year, and somebody gets to become a beekeeper if they want. Little hands can handle little bundles, while bigger hands can handle larger logs, and everyone is a stakeholder. So we have, for, like I said, from very young to like older, and everybody comes in and contributes. Next slide, please. Gifts. So I was saying we often talk about gifts, and we all have gifts to give, whether it's the gift of time, monetary gifts, a gift of knowledge and skill set, but everyone can contribute something. Next slide. Empowering the community. When Asian Americans were being targeted, we provided self-defense classes. we were actually approached by New York One and other groups to see if they could come and film, and we thought that that was sort of exploitive a little bit when you're feeling vulnerable to try to do something like that. So we stayed away from that, and our waste stays local. Like I said, 93% of it was going to build it green. And now that it's going away, we're going to have to handle all of that ourselves. And we've been turning trash into treasures. And that was something that a friend's mom actually said since 2012. Next slide, please. So is it really garbage, or was it treasure after all, right? So one man's treasure is another man's one man's trash is another man's treasure. We have a freegan among us, and he's actually taught us quite a bit about that movement. And so we sort of try to keep an open mindset and try to include everyone. Rather than being exclusive, we try to be as inclusive as possible. And next slide. So if you could please share the following, Deepa, and collect the information, or if you all like, you can email us at thecomposcollective@outlook.com. Just please provide us your first name, your last name, your telephone number, your email address. I promise you won't get more than 4 emails in a year. And, just to keep in touch and let us know what your skill set is. And what you do for a living or you did for a living, because that's important and that's some way to contribute, especially if you're in the area. Next slide. And that's our site. That is the linear park that they're trying to build on top, which is the Queensway people, I believe. And there's also another group that's competing to try to do something which is called the Queens Link. Next slide. So questions, I guess, and thank you for your time. I appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was amazing. I'm going to pass it on to Philip, who is going to lead our Q&A now.
Yes. Thank you both for very interesting presentations and about what your organizations are doing. I wanted to focus the question, of course, on city policy. In particular, the city has setting up curbside collection for in all the boroughs in a year or two, and unfortunately, apparently withdrawing support for organizations like yours. We're interested in people who in contributing to the voice to to not have this happen, because of all the other good things that your organizations are doing. Could you, either of you, comment on ways for people to get involved in voicing a policy to the city, that would be good for you guys?
Anneliese?
Do you want me to take that, Carlos?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, what's happening right now, I think part one is how you want to get involved. I mean, as Carlos said, I can just emphasize there's no shortage of need for whatever you bring to the table. And as Carlos said, we all bring something to the table. In terms of actionable items right now, if you haven't already signed Grow NYC's petition, it hit 45,000. The goal continues to rise. I'll drop that here in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, I just sent that to one person. Let's try it again. So that's the petition that's going around now. If you haven't already filled that out, that's, just kind of we'll keep you in the loop. There's also now testimony until Thursday you can submit. I can also share that link. I don't have it as easily accessible to really fight these cuts that are being done by the mayor. Just to clarify, and I think it's really important, everyone's been talking about these cuts and the fact that, schools have seen it and libraries have seen it, and many different organizations that need support. I want to be really clear that curbside composting is about 0.03% of sanitation's budget. What they're cutting, it's about $7 million in total. to give you a scale, I think.
Are they going forward though with the program to collect from all buildings, or they're stopping that?
It's not, I'll answer that. So it's not a policy. This is an executive sort of
legislation, yeah.
order, right? So every
Yes.
time there's a new mayor in town, they always have like some sort of big thing, and they say, oh, well, look, we discovered composting. And and they have their people talk about it, and they sort of try to, repackage it and relabel it and resell it.
Yeah.
But it's not a policy, it's not a law.
But our approach to use the mass scale of waste is just to make natural gas out of it in New York City, the official policy. There's no policy to provide soils for the, fertilized compost material for parks, for people, gardens, et cetera, on the part of the city, because I know that's what you guys do.
So yeah, so the current community composting program that exists right now does that. We produce massive amounts in terms of we being the nonprofits, Big Reuse, Grow NYC, Lower East Side Ecology Center is producing massive amounts of compost that's going back to parks, and it's going to street trees, and it's stewarding our land and therefore increasing the health of our urban landscape. It's increasing the health of the trees, as I said before, increasing the quality of the air, which of course we know is a problem. The majority, I want to be really clear, the majority of, from my understanding, and I can send many articles, the majority of the brown bin curbside program and the smart bin programs are going to anaerobic digestion, which supports methane production and gas usage, I would say, as a whole. And I did recently discover in a conversation that our Commissioner Tish, who's the commissioner of DSNY, does have family ties to pipelines, and part of her family's.
Interesting.
Yes, Carlos.
On a related subject, Seattle, I'm familiar with the city of Seattle. I used to live there in graduate school, and they have a program that requires people to separate their food waste and put it out with their other bins, and that there is a fine. It's a nominal fine, but you're subject to a fine if you don't do it. And virtually all their material goes to creating compostable soil and not generating energy with it, is my understanding. We're interested potentially that if there's a suite of policies that we can support for the city that work for a large city, that's an interesting thing. Would either of you care to comment on what other municipalities are doing and whether they're better than what, have advantages over what the city's doing?
I'm happy to defer to Carlos if I can just say one thing, which is that as of 2025, New Yorkers will be fined if they are not complying with current compost legislation.
Okay.
So there is a bit of a pickle that we're in the sense that if we're going to be fined in 2025, and right now these budget cuts are not only cutting composting in the community, but also the outreach and education. That means we are creating a situation where it seems like we wouldn't be educating or outreaching to community members across the city about composting, yet by 2025, people will receive fines if they don't do it properly. So there is an environmental justice issue there. A lot of people like to say, oh, you're a green, you're an environmentalist. This is very much a social, economic, and climate issue, in my opinion. And I defer to Carlos to.
I was just going to go back to saying that, for me, it comes down to not really looking at what other municipalities or other states or other cities are doing. New York is New York. We're massive in comparison to everybody else in the United States. We just need to find the commonality in our moral values. I think that's what we're missing. I think that's what they have maybe in the West Coast. Or us, the environmental people, call it the best coast. But I think that there are things that we can do here. And I think when it comes down to it, there are certain things that we can do because of the pegs, right? The program to eliminate the gap, which are the cuts that are happening. I think one of the things that ends up happening is that, you know, there's less also surveillance, there's also less of people checking in on things. So there's also a lot more freedom that's going to happen for people to be able to do things. So there's those loopholes that could be exploited by people in communities to actually do something.
Yeah.
And so it's not all sort of grim in that sense. There's whenever there's darkness, there's always light, right? And there's always a way to try to see value in that.
On that
And
on that subject, I wanted to get in another question that someone gave that's related to this. This is really a values question and raising awareness on people. And would either of you want to comment over the years that you've been doing this kind of work? How have you seen social norms changing in your community?
What do
Yeah.
you mean by social norms? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, basically the value for circularity, minimizing waste, promoting nature, and so on and so on. The values that you embody in your groups. Do you see any movement in the population at large, or we have a long way to go?
I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm happy to take some of this. So I said before, you know, my mom's a first generation Brooklynite. She was raised by immigrants. My father immigrated to this country. My grandfather, my mother's father, drove a milk and butter truck through New York. That's what he did. And this was in the day when you brought them in containers and you dropped them off in containers and you collected those containers. Um, I don't know if it's going forward as much as it's circular in that we're trying to get back to that. Um, there is a part of this that has to do with capitalism. There's a part of this that has to do with culture. But when you're speaking and what I hear you asking about social norms, it comes down to just showing up. And I think what Carlos, I don't want to speak for you, Carlos, so please, you know, call me out. But I think what we're both doing is showing up. And I
Yeah.
think the act of showing up is so simple and powerful in taking the extra second to sign the petition or to fill out testimony or to reach out and share and say, hey, I'd like to do this. Like, how can I help? When I grew up, when I was growing up, it was all about community. It was all about leaning on each other. And maybe again, that's my immigrant New York childhood, but it was real and it was how we learned and how we stuck together. It wasn't depending on legislation and politics and electeds and pegs getting cut. Like it, I'm sure this stuff was still happening, but we were just a microcosm. And I think what Carlos and I both do is that same microcosm. We're hyper connected. And as a result, I can say so many people walk by 3.5 years in and they're like, what are you doing? Who are you? They're either new to the neighborhood or they've just never been out on a Sunday morning. And they say, oh, I used to do this in my country. Oh, my XYZ in LMNOP does this. And that's community. And it can't be manufactured and it can't be written into legislation. It's
Yeah.
just, it's
I concur. You know, my experience is it's similar in that sense. It's I think we're in good hands in the new generations. They're a little more sensitive, but in a good way. I think they're aware. They have information very readily available to them. Unfortunately, not all the information is always the right information, but they are great. And what I am seeing in the last, what is it, 13 years that we've been doing this, it's the people show up. And one of the things that on that flow chart that I have is consistency, and consistency in that work ethic. Like you show up, you show up, you show up, and people show up for you, and you start seeing it. People show up. I'm always amazed. We always have like 30, 20 volunteers. Is Even if the weather is like cold or extremely hot, they show up. And it's because people want this, the people need this. And it's a place to become a place where they go and connect. And we are sort of building that sort of resiliency into the community, where, you know, if one of our members is a pest control person, if they have an issue, the pest control person shows up and takes care of it and doesn't charge them. We have another person that is an arborist a forester. They come and they'll cut your tree. Instead of charging you thousands of dollars, they'll charge you cost. So they take care of each other during an emergency. And there's a lady named Solnit that wrote like a really great book about it. It's like a short little book, but it talks about like sort of what happens during emergencies. And so a lot of my views, I think, are sort of filtered through that, right? Through my experiences. And what I've seen is that during the first 72 hours of any emergency that happens, nobody shows up for you. The federal government doesn't show up. The government doesn't show up at all. They'll send people to take a look and do an assessment, but nobody's coming out to give you water, give you electricity, help you. The people that are going to be helping you is your community, your friends, your neighbors. So you have to sort of have a connection. And I think these things are terrible for making connections. They actually do the opposite. And so actually getting out there and teaching kids how to hold a broom, teaching them how to rake, teaching them how to, shovel. They don't know how to do these things. It helps them. It sort of connects them. And what I've seen is groups of like teens that now like hang out together, groups of 20-something-year-olds and even older people that hang out together. And the intergenerational stuff is even much better. And I love it. They have like game nights and all that other stuff.
I wanted to get in one question to Anneliese about big reuse as opposed to the composting. How, in a few words, how would you characterize the difference between what your center does and Goodwill or Salvation Army or et cetera? Is there a significant difference in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're speaking specifically to our warehouse. So, Big Reuse is funded in part by the New York City Compost Project, which I'm not associated with directly, but the warehouse itself in Gowanus, in terms of comparing it to a Goodwill, a lot of the Goodwills or Housing Works or different thrift stores around the city that I've been in are highly curated and or limited to clothing products and kind of those fast ticket items. Carlos spoke to it a bit of like what you're going to buy and consumerism. Big Reuse, we have tiles, we have paint. You want to do an accent wall on your apartment? We have.
What do you do with stuff like books these days? Everyone has
books,
books. When
records.
someone died, my mother died 3 years ago, and it was very hard to donate books, and I felt terrible about just putting them in the dumpster. What do you do with things like books, clothes, et cetera, that are not moving? What happens to it so that your warehouse doesn't overflow?
Philip, you would be shocked. It all moves. It all moves
It
really,
does?
really quickly and faster than you would think. And we get a lot of nice things. A lot of people do bring things when a loved one passes away. We also in Brooklyn have, and I think this is also, I've seen it in other boroughs. I mean, putting things on your stoop is very popular as well, or the stoop of a nearby building or brownstone, again, depending on your community connection. But things do move. I don't think we've really had that issue, to be honest, because we have a warehouse. And again, we don't spend our energy curating and making it pretty and and putting fancy lights in. We spend our energy getting, and redistributing and really making sure that the things in our store are secured and therefore New Yorkers by New Yorkers. So you'd be surprised. There's a huge book area. There's a huge music area. I mean, I can't tell you how much there is, but just come to the warehouse. Go on us. We're right by the Lowe's.
Great. I think this might be a good time to close the meeting. Actually, we could go on quite a while. I want to thank you both. I mean, this has been really fascinating, especially considering in the context of the city policies and so on, and how important organizations like yours are. So this has been really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us. And I just want to take a moment, and if you could all go and sign those petitions, that would be great. 115 people, 115 families found out that they were going to lose their jobs pretty much right before Thanksgiving. And, they're getting directly affected. And before the year's over, during the holidays, this is happening. So it's a good idea to like show up for them.
And it's happening immediately.
if you could supply us a short sheet, like a half a page or whatever, with what you would like us to include in our newsletter for actions, because we communicate with many more, hundreds of members who may not even be here, are not here in today's meeting. We can get the word out. So it would be great if you could help, give us a little insert that we could just pop right into our newsletter.
I believe that
You may
Deepa
already have that.
link.
What?
Yeah, I believe that Deepa already put a link in from Grow NYC
Okay,
application into
Great.
the chat.
okay, we'll do that.
And I'll add in the testifying one. I'll send that to you later.
Okay.
So you have access to it.
Good.
All right. Thank
Well,
you so
thank you.
much. It's a pleasure
Yeah.
being here.
Thank you very much, everyone. And great questions. Have a good one.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I know.